In this lesson presentation, we'll focus on Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, and we'll make a comparison between the two poets. Specifically, we'll look at how both view death, but in order to begin that, we're going to start with some background knowledge both on the poet and their poetry, in order to help you make some inferences and draw conclusions later in the lesson. First, let's talk about Emily Dickinson. Dickinson had a normal childhood with an upper-class family, but by the time she entered her 20s, it was evident that she would not live the expected normal life of females in her time. She dressed in white and rarely left her house. Why did Emily isolate herself? Well, no one really knows. Some say she was in love with a married man, some say she couldn't bear to leave her home, but whatever the cause, she poured her heart into her poetry. What we do know is that she remained in her parents' home and wrote that poetry, very little of which was published during her lifetime. She did send some to a friend, Mr. Dickinson, but his criticism evidently kept her from attempting to get her poems published. After her death, friends and relatives found hundreds of her poems, which were published without titles and with very little editing. She had left instructions for her poetry to be destroyed, but her sister refused to do that. Dickens' poetry really kind of focuses on private observations. She led a very private life, and her poetry reflects that. She used slant rhyme, otherwise known as imperfect rhyme, and there were lots of dashes. It's almost as though she's rushing, or her poems, her lines are interrupted by these dashes. Her poetry is described as musical, and she uses a lot of startling imagery. Dickinson is now considered a persistent and powerful image in American poetry. Her poetry is included in American literature anthologies and has been used by songwriters such as Aaron Copland. Next to Walt Whitman. He was born to Quaker parents, and his formal schooling ended when he was just 11 years old. Because his family was poor, he worked as an apprentice at a newspaper office. But when he could afford it, he traveled extensively, gathering information and experiences for his writing. In this way, you can see he had a completely different background than Dickinson, and this difference in his background shows in the type of writing he does. Whitman's career: he was editor of 3 newspapers, the Freeman, the Brooklyn Eagle, and the New York Aurora. So he really would have seen life's events, international events, occurring to a much greater extent than Dickinson would have isolated within her family's home. He wrote Leaves of Grass, which he published himself in 1855. He actually published 9 editions between 1855 and 1892. His first edition in 1855 only had 12 poems, but the edition he published in 1892 contained more than 350 poems. Whitman's poetry is written in free verse, but he does use a lot of poetic elements like assonance, alliteration, onomatopoeia, parallel structure, and imagery. He writes primarily in ballad form, and he also uses some slant rhyme or imperfect rhyme, and also uses rather startling imagery. His poems appear simple, but they are actually more complicated than they appear. Here's an example of one of his poems, When Lilacs Last in Dooryard Bloomed. This is an elegy that was written shortly after Lincoln's assassination in order to memorialize President Lincoln.